Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for January 16, 2023, the 10% Committing Fraud edition. We begin with that story from the New York Times Deal Book. A new study found that fully 10% of publicly listed companies are engaging in fraud. This was through a recent report led by Alexander Dyke, a professor at finance at the University of Toronto, who published a provocative new study on the pervasiveness of corporate fraud. The study has been passed around in academia and now is being studied by general counsels, corporate leaders, and hopefully compliance professionals as well. Obviously, this portends poorly for culture and compliance, but it's something that every compliance professional needs to take a look at. Next up from the Financial Times, the EU Parliament vows more ethics reforms after the Qatar Gate historic corruption. The president has backed more ethics reforms in the wake of the sprawling corruption investigation, and she said she wants her 14-point plan to be delivered within a month, which will, of course, mean more compliance requirements on EU parliamentary members. Next up, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to weigh, this story comes to us from Reuters. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed to consider on Friday 2 cases accusing pharmacy operators of overbilling government health insurance for drug prescription, a dispute that could have broad implications for whistleblowers and the government's ability to go after fraud. The key question in both cases is whether companies can shield themselves from whistleblower fraud lawsuits by pointing to an objectively reasonable interpretation of the law that supports their conduct, regardless of whether they actually believe the interpretation in good faith at the time. In other words, if there's sort of a but-for argument, if there is some sort of interpretation out there that could be the basis of their fraudulent activity, it doesn't matter whether they knew about it, believed it, or anything else. You have to say with this current Supreme Court, it's pretty difficult to predict what they might do. And then our final story comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, CFO Journal. And companies are clashing with their lenders over the amount of interest they'll be paying as they switch leveraged loan agreements away from the LIBOR rate as it's phased out at the end of June. This has worldwide implications, and it's something that certainly every CFO needs to know about. But I really think every lawyer, corporate counsel, and compliance professional needs to understand that when you switch to a different rate, banks are going to try to increase their profits. So you need to be cognizant of that and try to get a neutral rate switch. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.